This is the Sony FX30. It's pretty much the same camera as the FX3, and this camera was designed for video creators. However, there is a few problems with this camera, and where some of these problems can't be fixed, there is one that I found a solution for that is making me consider switching to this camera for good. So let's dig into it. So the FX30 and the FX3 are true cinema cameras. They're built for video creators. They're not a hybrid where it's photo camera mixed with video features, so it can kind of be used for both. No, these cameras have everything built out for a video shooter. I mean, a big part of it is the ergonomics. So like the hand grip is much easier to hold, and then all the buttons on the camera itself are all laid out for video shooting, not photography. And it just makes it a lot easier to use one of these cameras for video. However, this body style definitely has a few problems, and it's actually kept me away from getting the FX3 and now the FX30, because essentially these are the exact same camera. The only difference is the sensor inside. When the FX3 came out, I used it on a documentary style project. I went up to a mountain near LA and I shot a project with my buddy around his photography, and it was all in bright sunlight, just like this. Super bright out, daytime, out in nature with dust and heat and everything else. And after making that video, I found that it was hard to use the FX3 to be able to shoot outdoor adventure style content. And it was actually easier at that time to use the A7S Mark III. Now, I've had the A7S Mark III since the initial launch of this camera. And I shot another documentary where I went up to Northern California and told a story of regenerative farming at this farm that was at the base of Mount Shasta. I was using Panasonic cameras before that, and this was kind of my introduction into Sony. The A7S Mark III had all of the features I wanted for my adventure documentary style content. And so through the process of making this video, it convinced me to switch everything over to Sony. Then the FX6 came out, and then I bought those for my production company. So now I'm 100% Sony. But when the FX3 initially came out, it didn't have all the features that it has now. So it wasn't as much of a video camera, and there were some major limitations. However, Sony has updated the FX3 and the FX30 to have basically all the features that you would expect out of a cinema camera. And now there's consistency whether you're going from the FX30 to the 3 to the FX6 to the FX9. It feels like one complete system. But there's still been some issues that have kept me on the fence, and why I haven't upgraded my A7S Mark III to an FX3 yet. The first problem kind of plagues all Sony cameras, and that is the lack of a veritable ND filter built in to the body itself. Having a cinema camera, you need to use ND filters, especially when you want to get cinematic looking footage, shooting shallow depth of field and getting the proper motion blur for your footage. Now, my understanding is that the issue with this size of body is that you can't fit the unit inside to be able to have the veritable ND. On the FX6, it's a much bigger body, and there's more space to put this device that flips your ND filter in and out and gives you that ability to have veritable control. On the FX6, when I'm shooting with that camera, it's amazing. You set your ND to auto, lock all your other settings, and when you're out in an environment like this where the light's fluctuating, well, the ND compensates for the exposure and you always have a good looking image. But you're not changing your shutter speed, ISO, or aperture to get that. Whereas on this size camera, there's no option for variable ND, and I don't think there's gonna be a variable ND anytime soon. So whether it's the A7S III or one of these bodies, it's just something that we're gonna have to live with. Now, there are a couple solutions. You could use the ND filters that go on front of your lens. That's your traditional style. The problem is with these styles of filters, anything you put in front of the lens, there could be color issues. And I actually just did a video recently all about color issues with ND filters, and I found that most ND filters have a pretty significant shift. So it's just something that you're gonna have to pay attention to when you're adding extra ND in front of your lens. Now the other option is interesting. It's a filter that goes on the inside of your lens, right between the lens and the sensor. And I've heard of some other creators using this option because it gives you the ability to not have to put anything in front of your lens. Now, personally, I don't know how I feel about putting an ND filter between the sensor and the lens, especially when I'm out doing adventure style content, because there's a lot of opportunity for dust and dirt and moisture to get in between the lens and the sensor. And I typically try to minimize the amount of time I'm taking the lens off and putting another lens on. And the other thing is it's not a variable ND. So with light shifting, you're gonna still have to adjust your settings even though you do have this ND filter between your sensor and your lens. Now, the second big issue plagues all Sony cameras, no matter which Sony camera you're on, and that is the lack of shutter angle. They all have shutter speed, which is to be expected on a hybrid camera, but on a cinema camera, there's no shutter angle. And it's really frustrating because shutter angle is what I use in every other camera system that has it, and on my FX6, it's all you have. You don't use shutter speed. And if you don't know the difference between shutter speed and shutter angle, well, old school cameras that used to shoot on film used what's called shutter angle. It was a rotating disc, and the disc would rotate 360 degrees for each frame that you're exposing. And the amount that that disc was open versus closed was your shutter angle. So 180 degree shutter angle, which is half the disc, would give you motion blur that is natural to the human eye. And when you're shooting video, this is the look that you're trying to achieve to get that cinematic look. You want to shoot at double that of your frame rate, which is what you'll hear for shutter speed, which is effectively the same thing as a 180 degree shutter angle. Now, the reason that shutter angle is so much better than shutter speed is when you're changing frame rates. So oftentimes I'll shoot at 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second, depending on the scene that I'm filming and I want to have some slow motion. Well, whenever you bump your frame rate up, you have to adjust your shutter speed, because anytime you change your frame rate, you now have to adjust your shutter speed to compensate to shoot at double that of your frame rate to get this proper motion blur. However, when you're using shutter angle, you just leave it on 180 degrees, and no matter what frame rate you're filming in, you're always gonna have the proper motion blur. And then when it comes to actually changing your shutter angle, you're doing it with intention. So if you use a 90 degree shutter angle, there's gonna be less motion blur. It's gonna make things feel a little more choppy, a little more frantic. Whereas if you use a 360 degree shutter angle, well, you're gonna have a lot of motion blur and it's gonna give you that more dreamy quality. So when you change your shutter angle, you're doing it with intention rather than always having to make sure that your shutter speed is where it needs to be for the frame rate that you're shooting in. I know it seems like a small thing, but it's definitely something that would be super useful in a cinema camera, because the majority of what you're shooting on a cinema camera is video. Now, for me, the biggest problem with this body style, well, I'll tell you in 1 second, because I just want to mention that I have a course down below in the description that goes through everything you need to know to master your camera for video creation. So if you're newer to video creation or you want to have a better understanding of how to go completely manual with your camera, well, head down in the description. It's over on my website, thecreatorfilmschool.com, and it takes you through everything that you need to know when you're out making videos. The biggest problem with this body, the FX30 and the FX3, is the lack of a viewfinder. For you, that might not be a big issue because you might not be shooting outdoors in extreme sun that often, but where I shoot, I'm often outdoors on a mountain, out in the desert, Southern California, and there's always that big, bright, fiery thing up in the sky, and it makes it really hard to see the screen. When I'm out shooting in these bright sunlit conditions, I can't see the screen, I can't see my exposure. So I could use all the tools that are in this camera to be able to see my exposure using things like zebras and stuff. But personally, I like to see my image when I'm out in the field to make sure that things are looking good, just as a reference, especially when I'm setting up shots. And my biggest frustration with this style body is that there is no viewfinder. You have to rely on the screen. And so when I was shooting the documentary on the farm with the A7S Mark III, it was super easy to shoot because I could always just put the camera up to my eye and be able to see exactly what I'm shooting. But when I went to shoot with the FX3 on a mountain with my buddy, Well, I was struggling so much with the FX3 to be able to see my footage, and it was a lot harder experience. And because of that, I never actually switched over to the FX3. However, now that I've been playing with this FX30 for the last week, I've been trying to figure out a good solution, because the way that this camera is laid out, it just works better for video. And the A7S Mark III is more set up for photography. Even though it is a video camera, it's got all the same features of the FX3, the layout is more of a hybrid photography camera. So I really want this camera to work. And some creators have told me to put an external monitor on top of this, but personally, I don't want to carry a big external monitor on top of the camera and have to deal with extra batteries, especially if I was doing something like climbing a mountain. And so I found this, which is a really cheap little product. It's a viewfinder. I've seen these before, but this one actually makes working with the FX30 and FX3 so much easier. And so what this does is it goes on the screen and it blocks out all the light, and you could use it like a viewfinder. So you could put it up to your face, or if the camera's down low, you could also just put it on the screen and you could actually see your shot. And what's great about this product is that it's also a magnifier. And so it just makes it a lot easier to see everything on the screen. Now, what makes this one different are these little straps you see hanging off the side. I've tested a few different versions of this, different companies, different models, ones where you just like pop it out and you hold it here. But the issue is, like, if you don't have some way to attach it to the screen, then it kind of slides around and it's not as effective and it's kind of a pain. Whereas this one, you got these little bungee things on the side. But as I'm shooting, it just takes a second to strap this on either side of the camera, and now it's on there. It's not coming off. And I could use this up to my eye, like a traditional viewfinder, or even I could just pop this off, pull the screen out, be able to still use the screen like I normally would if I was hand holding this camera and it wasn't up to my eye. So this $30 accessory that I found on Amazon actually makes me want to get this camera now. The biggest problem for me was not having a viewfinder, and that's kept me away from this style of camera. But with this external viewfinder on the back that has these little bungees, well, I could stabilize the camera on my eye so I could get a more stable shot when I'm shooting this way, and I could also see my image much better. Now, one other thing that makes this super useful for this style of camera is that if your handle's on top, well, you're not gonna bump it when you put your eye up to the eyepiece. And then if you have a microphone on top, you're not gonna bump it either because your eyepiece is so much further back. And then also the bungees that hold it onto the camera don't hit any of the buttons. If I was to use this same product on the A7S Mark III, well, there's some buttons that might get in the way of these bungees, and you'd have to be more careful. With this, they sit nicely on the FX3 and FX30, that this product kind of feels like it was made for it, which I just know it's a general viewfinder, but it works so well. It's a little thing, but this little thing is gonna finally make me switch from the hybrid style camera to true cinema camera for this size body. Now, if you want to see my full review on the FX30 and all the features that are packed into this, make sure you check out this video right here. And also, make sure you head to thecreatorfilmschool.com, check out my course on mastering your camera for filmmaking. I'll see you on the next one.